It was at this very hour, 24 hours ago, that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis let go of life. And the world marvels again at her incredible inner strength. It defined her as a young widow 30 years ago, and as she faced death these last few days. Tonight we look at Jacqueline Onassis through the eyes of women who shared a unique bond with her. They are America's First Ladies.
First Lady Hillary Clinton had a very close relationship with Mrs. Onassis. They met several times at the White House. And last August, Mrs. Onassis played host to the Clintons at her summer home on Martha's Vineyard. The two women exchanged confidences and advice, and we're pleased to have Mrs. Clinton share her thoughts from the White House. Mrs. Clinton, we thank you for being with us on what must be for you personally a very sad day.
It is.
You are sitting in the diplomatic reception room, which you chose specifically because it was one of the rooms decorated by Jacqueline Kennedy when she was in the White House.
Well, that's right, Barbara. You know, it was on the tour that Mrs. Kennedy gave the entire country after she had begun the redecoration project. And as she said, it is the room that guests come in when they first come to the White House. That's where they are received. And you'll see this wonderful French wallpaper that she was able to acquire that was hand-painted in 1834, which showed scenes of America in our early years, as well as the Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington over the fireplace. I walk through this room probably 5 or 6 times a day, and it is so beautifully done, and it gives such a wonderful entrance to the White House because of its sense of history as well as its graciousness.
Mrs. Clinton, you had a very special relationship with Jacqueline Onassis. You became very close and shared many conversations, especially about bringing up children. She tried to do that in privacy. You have tried to do that. Can you share with us some of her insights and advice?
Well, that is one of the great gifts that she gave to my family personally by being willing to talk with me about what it is like when you're thrust into the public eye in such a dramatic way, if your primary obligation is as a parent, as I believe mine is, and as she certainly believed hers was. And when I first visited her and had a wonderful long visit over lunch in her apartment, I was filled with questions about how on earth did you manage to have 2 such wonderful children. And she kept stressing over and over again that no matter where you were with your children, you had to remember that you were their primary example and their primary caregiver. And she told me how she had worked very hard to make sure that both of her children had private space, that they were not considered public property insofar as that is possible. She gave me some hints, too, about how to make sure that when a child is surrounded by Secret Service agents and other adults, how they can still be themselves and have time and also take responsibility. She told me a story once about some older boys taking a bike away from John and how the adults around were going to intervene, and she stopped them and she said, no, that's something he has to learn how to deal with on his own. And she just was so willing to talk through with me what was, for me, a very important part of my husband's public life.
She tried so hard to preserve her own privacy while in the White House and after. And you have talked yourself now about having to carve out your own role, dealing with the life and all the spotlight on you. Was she able to give you some advice on maintaining privacy with all of us asking you questions and everything?
Well, she recognized that even though she was in many ways the most well-known woman in the world for many years, the times were different when President Kennedy was in office. There was more time for private family time and going off on weekends together, but she really insisted that she was able to be a private person. And I have tried to, go off and do things with my daughter. We went to a ballet recital this week. I go to her school, and I consider that part of the joy of being a mother, but also something that is part of our private life. And I got a lot of courage to keep doing those sorts of things from her example.
The role of First Lady has changed a great deal. I mean, Mrs. Kennedy, when she was Mrs. Kennedy, occupied herself primarily with the home and with the decoration, and it's certainly changed today. But what do you think was her influence? What do you think, from your own knowledge of her, is her legacy?
Well, Barbara, I think it's so important that any woman who's in this position be given a chance to use her own talents and make her own choices. We are so much richer as a nation because Mrs. Onassis brought to this White House such a wonderful awareness of art and culture, so that when she began to transform the White House, she did it with taste, with a sense of history, and certainly every day, literally thousands of people are able to see her legacy in the public rooms, and the President and I are able to enjoy what she did in the residence part of the White House. So that is important because it helped maintain and really, once again, elevate the history of our country through this wonderful house. But beyond that, I think she set an example for women that the choices one makes have to be one's own, that the choices that she made at every step in her life appear to me, as someone who didn't know her well but admired her greatly and grew to call her a friend, to be grounded in her own sense of integrity. And that's what I would hope would be one of her legacies as people celebrate her style and grace and her beauty and her heroism in the face of the tragedy of her life, that they see a woman who not only is a national treasure and a great First Lady, but someone who really kept her own counsel and made the decisions she thought were right for her and her family. I don't think there is any greater legacy for any woman than to be able to say that at the end of one's life.
Very gracious of you, Mrs. Clinton, to be on with us today.
Thank you.
We appreciate it, and we thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
We also have the opportunity today to speak with former First Lady Betty Ford, and by telephone with Rosalyn Carter and Nancy Reagan. Lady Bird Johnson issued a statement by telephone last night.
She was an image of beauty and romance, and leaves an empty place in the world as I have known it. We shared a unique time, and I always thought of her as my friend. I feel a poignant, personal sense of loss, and a larger one for the nation.
Mrs. Ford, what do you think was the contribution of Mrs. Onassis when she was in the White House? Did she change the role of First Ladies?
Well, Jacqueline Onassis brought a totally new picture or vision of First Ladies. We had been in Washington just after the Roosevelt period and there during the Truman and Eisenhower period, where most of the First Ladies were along, you know, they were more not elderly,
Sedate?
sedate. And this beautiful young girl at 31 years old who came upon the scene not only with all her beauty, but Barbara, there was an elegance and a grace about her. And as she served in that office with Jack Kennedy, to me there was a real brilliance.
Mrs. Ford, you had some difficult times in the White House living in that goldfish, and certainly Mrs. Onassis did as Mrs. Kennedy. How did she feel about politics and that whole aspect of the life?
I don't think that Mrs. Onassis liked politics per se. I think she was very in love with her family and her children, and she enjoyed what she did in the White House as far as being able to restore it. But the political side of it, I don't think really appealed to her.
What's the best part of being First Lady, and what's the best part of not being First Lady when you leave?
Well, I'm sure the best part of being First Lady for me was having my husband in an office close by and not traveling so much as he did when he had the leadership of the Republican Party.
You know, Mrs.
Congress.
Kennedy, Mrs. Onassis has said the same thing, that those were the best years for her, being close to her husband in the White House.
Well, maybe there's many of us that feel that way.
As you look back, if we speak historically, what do you think is the legacy of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis?
I think she could be a role model for any woman, whether she was in the White House or not, because she had the grace and dignity that was unusual for someone under the stress of being such a public person. And she handled it beautifully. She was a very brave woman because she had terrible things happen in her life. And yet she always handled it with a great deal of dignity.
When you think of Mrs. Onassis, Mrs. Carter, what flashes into your mind?
I think there was a great excitement in the whole country when she and President Kennedy were in the White House. I remember that.
What would you think would be the lasting contribution of Mrs. Onassis as First Lady?
Well, I think she brought a dignity to the White House, and made it into a place of excitement and history. And I think that is probably what people remember her for.
Mrs. Reagan, you had a very special and important to you conversation with Mrs. Onassis at the time of the attempted assassination on your husband.
Yes.
What did she say to you and you to her?
Well, I didn't know if he was going to live or not. And she contacted me and then wrote me a very lovely, sensitive letter at a time that I really badly needed it. It was very thoughtful of her and very kind, and I'll be very grateful to her always for that.
What did she mean to you?
She was a woman of tremendous courage and resiliency and dignity and grace. Every First Lady puts her own stamp on the White House, but I don't think any of us have put a stamp like Jackie put on the White House.
Because every First Lady does put her stamp on, but that is a bond. All of them knew what it was like to be First Lady. To me, you know, this loss really does end an era, because to me, something of that Camelot essence was around as long as Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was around. I don't think we're going to see that again.
Well, I sort of disagree. I think that Camelot was a period of time, and I'm not even sure it really was Camelot, but when they were there, they were so young and beautiful. But looking at these First Ladies, you know, we have such a tendency to criticize, and I'm not making apologies for any of them, but each of them went through so much in the White House. Each of them had a period of pain, and I could go through the list. It's such a tough life, and they do handle it. As I look at them, each of them has handled it so well. I think a little more, attention.
It's been a long time since we haven't had a First Lady, like, was it Buchanan or may have been the last one when there wasn't a First Lady in the White House. Thank you, Barbara. When we come back, a life punctuated by the most intense moments, remembered by people who were there, the triumphs and the tragedies, and the marriage that stunned the country. An intimate look at Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Stay with us.
"2020", brought to you by Kmart. Brand names, low prices, the latest fashions. Kmart. Is this place great or what?
There is perhaps no other woman of our time who had the unbelievable highs and unimaginable sorrow of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. When she and John Kennedy came into the White House, they brought with them a world of beauty and excitement, vitality and youth that had not been seen before. My colleagues, Diane Sawyer and Sam Donaldson, joined me in this portrayal of her life, the worst of times and the best.
Arriving at the White House grounds, Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy head for the specially constructed stand. We're joined by Vice President and Mrs. Johnson. They will review the inaugural parade.
It was as if they were the nation's royal couple, rather than President and First Lady, and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy seemed like a princess. She was born into wealth and privilege. Her parents, John and Janet Lee Bouvier, were part of high society. Though they later divorced, she adored her dashingly handsome father, and she loved to ride horses, a passion that stayed with her all of her life. She was a debutante, learned French in Paris, and later became the inquiring camera girl for a Washington newspaper. There she met the most eligible bachelor, the junior senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy. In September of 1953, they were married in Newport, Rhode Island. More than 600 guests were there. The entire United States Senate was invited. The wedding brought together the wealth and power of the Bouviers and the Kennedys. It seemed a rocky marriage at first. Mrs. Kennedy, shy and elegant, didn't seem to fit in with the boisterous touch football camaraderie of the Kennedy clan. She often looked like an outsider.
I want you to meet my daughter Caroline and my wife Jackie.
How do you do? I'm glad you had a chance to see something of the Senate, and now to see our house where we've lived a year, and since Caroline was born.
Although friends spoke often of her private sense of humor, she was never totally comfortable with her public role and was a reluctant campaigner. Still, she was a rarity at the time, a political wife who was young, charming, and beautiful. In 1960, her husband's race for the presidency began.
Entering 7 state primary elections, he won them all.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
It was a heady time. They were as glamorous as movie stars. And on his first trip to Europe in 1961, John Kennedy discovered that his wife was also a political asset.
President de Gaulle was their host. The president was really in the background. She was the center of attention. At one point, he said, half facetiously and half seriously,
I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it.
Jacqueline Kennedy was becoming the nation's trendsetter. Her hair, her clothes were discussed as much as her husband's foreign policy. She was used to clothes from Paris, but she commissioned an American designer, Ola Cassini, to create her wardrobe.
What was the Jackie look?
The Jackie look was, first of all, the premise was the greatest luxury in workmanship in fabrics, and with delicate individual colors.
Pale colors?
Pale colors.
Very simple?
Very, very simple. There was not a young woman in the world that didn't want to look like Jackie Kennedy.
In a time when political wives were still mostly seen and not heard, she had few civic projects of her own. But she took to restoring the White House with zeal. And when she led CBS cameras on a tour of her home, her shy, whispering voice is what most people remember.
It just seemed to me such a shame when we came here to find hardly anything of the past in the house.
Many of the changes she made then remain in place today. She helped to turn the White House into an almost magical place, a flurry of state dinners and cultural events, foreign leaders, the Capitol elite. Americans love to watch.
Jackie knew how to organize those parties. She was a consummate hostess, and the president was proud of it, and he knew it was going to be great when she pitched in and did it. She was a fabulous party giver.
Those White House years, Mrs. Kennedy would later tell her friends, were the happiest days of her life because she saw so much of her husband and her children.
And I give her great credit for the degree to which she did remain a private person, particularly, as I suggest, with respect to her children. They needed privacy.
Even then, she rarely spoke to the press and remained a mysterious figure to the public.
She thought we were intruders and that we were prying and that she wanted her private life and she didn't know why we had to be constantly writing about her. She had a mystique that was headline making. Every editor wanted every story about her.
One of her darkest hours came in August of 1963. Her third child, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, died of an infection 3 days after birth. It devastated the family. Mrs. Kennedy needed time away, and with her sister Lee, took a Mediterranean cruise as the guest of a man she would later marry, Aristotle Onassis. She returned refreshed and told friends she was anxious to begin campaigning with her husband for the 1964 presidential race. One of their first campaign stops was to be Dallas, Texas, in November, her last trip as First Lady.
President's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes.
It was a savage moment that day in Dallas. For the woman who was both wife and First Lady, a moment of uncomprehending horror.
Something has happened in the motorcade route.
For the nation and the world, a weekend of disbelief and profound sorrow. Against this backdrop of tragedy, it became a transcending time for Jacqueline Kennedy, a time when she rose from the backstage of history to a central role that few could have predicted she would play so well.
She had a strong feeling. She had a strong way of reacting in all the time that I was with her. And so it doesn't surprise me that she handled it that way. But
Pierre Salinger, then the White House press secretary, remembers.
She was graceful, and she was under tremendous pressure.
David Brinkley remembers also.
Why did the president go to Dallas, after all?
Lyndon Johnson persuaded him to go, because you will recall that John Kennedy barely won the election at all, and he almost lost Texas.
So the Kennedys came to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, and got into an open car with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. The motorcade turned onto Elm Street, drove past the Texas School Book Depository building, and the screams of delight turned to screams of horror as Lee Harvey Oswald fired his 3 shots. Nellie Connally, cradling her wounded husband John in her arms, remembers Mrs. Kennedy's first words.
The first thing she said was, "Jack, what have they done to you?" That broke my heart. I knew what they had done to him by then.
The famous Zapruder film shows that Mrs. Kennedy clambered onto the trunk of the limousine. She was saved from falling by Secret Service agent Clint Hill. The motorcade raced to Parkland Hospital, where Governor Connally survived. It was too late for the president. Not only was it over for the Kennedys, it was over for the country. There was a new president. And at that moment came the first of those acts by Jacqueline Kennedy that made such an indelible impression. Mrs. Kennedy stood with her husband's successor, Lyndon Johnson, as he took the oath of office in the cramped cabin of Air Force One as it sat on the tarmac at Dallas's Love Field. When Air Force One arrived back at Andrews Air Force Base outside of Washington, the casket was taken off the plane by hydraulic lift. Mrs. Kennedy rode with her husband's body to Bethesda Naval Medical Center, where the autopsy was performed. At 3 o'clock the next morning, they all came back to the White House. And even though she was emotionally and physically exhausted, Mrs. Kennedy began to plan her husband's public farewell. The president's casket rested in the White House East Room until Sunday, when it was taken to the Capitol to lie in the Great Rotunda, Mrs. Kennedy walking with it up the marble steps of the East Front. Inside, she kissed the flag-draped coffin. But again, she was mixing a strong image for the public her husband had led, with private thoughts for those who had served with him.
About 48 hours after John was killed, she went to every top advisor to the president and handed them a package. In other words, she had gone into his private things and found things that she thought that each one of them would like to have to remember John Kennedy. And I still have mine. It's a cigar with JFK on it.
The funeral was on Monday. French President Charles de Gaulle and scores of other world leaders walked up Connecticut Avenue to attend. And at St. Matthew's Cathedral came the most memorable picture of the day, the picture that would tear the heart out of all who saw it. Young John Kennedy Jr., who that very day turned 3, saluted his father's casket.
I was standing on the steps at St. Matthew's Cathedral when Mrs. Kennedy, first the casket was being carried out. She was walking behind the casket holding John's hand, and she sort of bent down to him, and he saluted.
It was a scene nobody has ever forgotten. How can you forget a little boy saluting his father's funeral?
Can't. The whole country, I think, it was a collective sob when they saw that.
Everybody was in tears, everyone in town, as far as I could see, including myself.
From the church, the motorcade went to Arlington Cemetery, to the spot on the hill where John Kennedy had once stood and said this was where he might want to spend eternity. Mrs. Kennedy lighted the eternal flame, a symbol that for those who lived it and those who loved it, the Kennedy presidency would never die. As for herself, over the 4 days in November that began in Dallas, Jacqueline Kennedy had changed her public image forever.
She was no longer seen as a not very busy, not very publicly involved figure who concentrated on clothes and so on, as a real woman who had been through hell and survived it.
Been through hell?
Yes. Having your husband shot in front of your face, sitting right here. If that's not hell, what is?
After the funeral, she thanked all the strangers who had tried to console her.
The knowledge of the affection in which my husband was held by all of you has sustained me, and the warmth of these tributes is something I shall never forget.
Weeks later, in a rare interview, she remembered how her dead husband had loved a song from a Broadway musical.
Camelot! Camelot!
It would become the one-word key to a door of unfulfilled dreams and memories. It was also her goodbye. The most famous and popular woman in the world, a woman even urged to run for office, decided to go into private life. 5 years later, another wrenching shock. At a hotel in Los Angeles, the nightmare repeated itself. This time, Robert Kennedy, the brother-in-law who had become her close friend. She reportedly told a friend, "I don't want to live in America anymore. I don't want my children to live in America anymore." Months later, she left the United States for Greece for a meeting with a mysterious shipping tycoon. In October 1968, she stunned the world. Jackie Kennedy became Jackie Onassis. It was greeted at the time as almost unthinkable, as though an American queen had conspired in her abduction from the throne. She went to work. She became a book editor, which gave her a chance to live in the world of words she loved, without having to write them herself and give up her privacy. Author Jonathan Cott.
Her curiosity and her enthusiasm and her intuition and her imagination were so strong.
He says she shared his fascination with mysticism and lots of coffee.
You could feel highly energized for 2 or 3 days after speaking to her for an hour.
One of the few times she ever went public was in 1975. It was over her distress that New York's magnificent Grand Central Station was threatened with demolition. Ashton Hawkins, Executive Vice President of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
She was just struck by the beauty of this great building, the great cathedral of New York, if you will, a secular cathedral. And nothing like it really is in New York. And the idea that it would disappear was very sad to her. She said it doesn't have to happen.
Grand Central was saved, and later 50 states enacted similar legislation to protect historic landmarks. In the coming years, she would live as a real New Yorker, hailing taxis, walking, jogging, sweeping into restaurants, walking with her grandchildren. And friends say truly happy with the urbane businessman at her side, Maurice Templesman. It was Templesman who stood by her throughout her illness. Only days ago, they strolled together with daughter Caroline in New York Central Park, a final public glimpse of a graceful woman who had cherished privacy. A life lived with joy and pain, endured and celebrated in public and private. "I've been through a lot, and I've suffered a great deal," Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis once said, "but I've had a lot of happy moments as well. I've come to the conclusion that we must not expect too much from life. You cannot separate the good from the bad, and perhaps there's no need to do so either."
We'll be right back.